This series explores the proper ethical treatment of non-human animals. In this section, we'll look at various criteria put forth by philosophers around what qualifies an organism to have moral status. That is, to be worthy of our moral consideration. Through this examination, we notice the various justifications for human superiority, and the ways in which we've made our species out to be somehow special and distinct from the rest of animals. This supposed superiority is what allows us to use animals in problematic ways, such as in animal factory farms, experimentation and research labs, or circuses and zoos. Therefore, we deconstruct those justifications of human superiority, those supposed differences between humans and other animals that rob them of their moral worth and permit us to mistreat them. Our goal is to see whether there's a legitimate moral defense for the problematic ways in which we're using animals, or if our current interactions with them are not morally justified, and therefore we should be changing our practices. Of course, note that humans and animals can be different in some ways, while also maintaining that animals have moral status for other reasons. In other words, differences between species don't equate to hierarchy and permission to treat animals with cruelty. These differences, then, would be considered non-moral differences, as they don't factor into moral status. I wanted to include this for the sake of clarity, but, of course, we'll be examining potential moral differences in this section. Okay, let's begin with two hypothetical situations so that you can observe your intuitions and see whether they change as we move into the discussion. First, imagine you're watching a person walk their dog, and you witness someone come up and kick the dog. Then they kick the person who's walking that dog. In your mind, are these acts equally wrong? Or does it feel more wrong to kick the person than the dog, or the other way around? Or second, consider this example. You're eating a meal with chicken in it as you hear from a friend that their dog was kicked, and you learn the news that a crate of cats was dumped in a nearby lake, and that one of the world's last remaining white rhinos was trophy hunted. You feel outraged at these abuses to the dog, cat, and rhino as you eat your chicken. Okay, that was the example. The question is, why is it that some people would find these all to be awful and morally disagreeable acts while also eating meat from industrial animal farms? For example, chickens in industrial farms are kept in a 1 foot by 1 foot space, their beaks are clipped so they don't peck each other, and they're killed when they stop laying eggs. Clearly, these are harmful acts, but why do we object to hurting a dog while participating in meat consumption that hurts these farm animals, such as chickens? Basically, why do some people care about certain animals more than others? Why is there an inconsistency in our attitudes, or a gradient among which animals matter most? Is there a legitimate moral justification for treating some animals better than other animals, and for treating humans better than non-human animals altogether? It's a general goal of philosophy to make our actions and beliefs consistent with each other, rather than being contradictory. This means we must treat different animals equally, and treat humans and animals equally, if their morally relevant characteristics are alike. In other words, we're only justified to treat humans and animals differently if it's indeed the case that humans and animals differ morally. Similarly, we can only treat dogs and cows differently if it can be shown that dogs and cows differ morally. And so the question is, what makes something or someone matter morally? Basically, how does one come to have moral status and be deserving of moral consideration? This is the central question underlying animal ethics. Throughout the history of Western philosophy, most philosophers have thought that only humans have moral status, simply because we're humans. In this view, only humans have an intrinsic value, which means the value that something has in and of itself. That is, it doesn't require the addition of anything else to make it valuable. It has its own value simply by existing and doing its own thing. Meanwhile, this view goes, other animals are merely instrumentally valuable, which means that their value comes from their ability to help us achieve a goal, namely, animals helping humans meet our needs of food or clothes. Basically, on this view, animals aren't valuable in and of themselves, but they're only valuable because they help humans. In a nutshell, it's intrinsic value for humans and instrumental value for non-human animals. To be clear, this view comes from tradition. For example, our culture has historically raised farm animals and hunted and fished for meat consumption. However, tradition, on its own, is not a legitimate moral justification for doing something. For example, it may be part of a culture's tradition to own human slaves, but this clearly doesn't justify the practice of slavery, simply because they have a history in doing it. Other people seek to justify this unequal arrangement between humans and animals by claiming that we have a need to eat animal meat in order to survive. However, empirical data from nutrition science shows that humans can be healthy without consuming meat. And still other people seek to justify this view of using animals for our human purposes by pointing to economic benefits. That is, the claim that industrial farms contribute to our country's economy. However, again, the abolition of slavery in the U.S. South upset economic arrangements that depended on black slave labor. But most of us would agree that this abolition was the morally justified outcome. Hence, economic productivity on its own is not morally relevant. So then, we're still left with this significant question. Why do humans alone supposedly have this special moral status? Why do we matter more than non-human animals? If it were true that only humans have moral status and no other organisms do, then we must demonstrate that there are morally relevant differences between humans and other species. So, I'll now share various criteria that philosophers have offered in the past that would qualify humans for this special moral status. As I share these, we'll look at responses and rebuttals to see if the argument holds up. Many philosophers, including René Descartes, answer this question of moral differences by pointing to rationality, or the ability that humans possess to reason in order to find the truth of something. Other philosophers point to language, or self-awareness, or some other impressive cognitive capacity. However, here's a response to that. Peter Singer, an animal ethicist from Australia, says that whichever human characteristic you point to as giving us a special moral status that other animals lack, well, you can find examples of animals displaying that trait to the same or greater degree than it is displayed in certain humans. Let's break that down. Any characteristic that we say is morally relevant actually turns out to be shared across species and not unique to humans alone. For example, certain primates display cognitive abilities that a human baby or a severely cognitively handicapped person cannot. Indeed, the infant or cognitively disabled person may not be able to exercise rationality or use language or even be self-aware. And yet, our intuition is that we wouldn't throw these people under the bus. And further, that it would be unjust to treat infants and disabled people worse than middle-aged, able-bodied people. Rather, we think that these people, of course, matter and deserve our moral consideration. So this shows that intellectual capacities alone cannot give humans special moral status. Another possible criterion for human special moral status is our membership to the species Homo sapiens. But stop and reflect. Does this seem right to you? If you say that it's simply our membership in the species Homo sapiens that gives us special moral status, then how is this any different than the injustice of giving one social group greater moral consideration than another social group? For example, the sexism of valuing men over women, or the racism of valuing white people over people of color. Clearly, membership in the species Homo sapiens is not a good reason for special moral status, and we can reject this criterion as speciesism. Speciesism is defined as, quote, giving preference to our own species over another in the absence of morally relevant differences, end quote. In other words, it is prejudice. Fortunately, things take a turn here, as some philosophers have offered criteria that expand the circle of moral consideration beyond humans and to include non-human animals. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill say that moral consideration requires something to have sentience, that is, the ability to experience pleasure and pain. Singer says that pleasure is intrinsically good, while pain is intrinsically bad. Therefore, we should equally consider the pleasure and pain that any organism feels, not just humans. This expands the circle of moral status to non-human animals who can also feel pleasure and pain. The idea is that if you're sentient, then it matters to you how your life goes, and so your interests must be accounted for. Recall our earlier example. If the person had kicked a rock rather than a dog or another human, then you likely wouldn't have felt that anyone was wronged. You likely feel that it was wrong because they kicked a dog and a person who both feel pleasure and pain, and whose interests it's in to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Or at least this is the utilitarian argument, that it is morally correct to do that thing that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain for the group being considered, and it is morally wrong to do that action whose consequences maximize pain and minimize pleasure for the group being considered. Singer calls this the equal consideration of interests, meaning we must equally consider the interests of all sentient beings. Since all sentient beings have an interest in avoiding pain, it would be unjust to value humans' interest in avoiding pain over other animals' interest in avoiding pain. This doesn't mean that we must treat animals identically to how we treat humans, however, since different species have different things that are good for them. But rather, it's simply that we must consider preferences for pleasure and avoidance of pain equally amongst all species. Basically, humans' ability to feel pleasure or pain doesn't matter more than other animals' ability to feel pleasure or pain. And therefore, if we wouldn't do some harmful act to a person, like kicking them or raising them for meat consumption, then we shouldn't do this harmful act to other sentient animals either. However, sentience as a criterion for moral consideration can also be criticized. If the ability to feel pleasure or pain evolved in organisms to help them survive and reproduce, then why is this survival strategy valued over other organisms who lack sentience but survive and reproduce in different ways? In this way, some philosophers argue that all living organisms, whether or not they can experience pleasure and pain, have moral status. Therefore, plants would also have moral status. Further, some philosophers extend the circle of moral consideration to include holistic entities like rivers, mountains, forests, and other ecosystems. However, this would be an entirely new video. In conclusion, after hearing these arguments for what qualifies something to have moral status, where do you wind up? Do you think that only humans have moral status, or that all sentient animals, both human and non-human, have moral status? Or do you think that all living organisms, including plants and fungi, maybe even bacteria, have moral status? And whichever position you're convinced by, what does this mean for how you lead your life and act in the world?